Hey, good afternoon, and welcome to the second episode of the new Inspired Learning Conversation. I'm Dave Quinn, and I'm the Director of Technology Integration for the Mendon-Upton Regional School District. We've decided to link our MURSD Leads author interview series with our new Inspired Learning project, and thus the new name of the series. Today is a personally special edition of the Inspired Learning Conversation as I welcome my mentor and doctoral advisor, Dr. Julie Coiro, to the show. Much of my thinking and rethinking about education has come from the numerous conversations that we've had over the years about ways to make learning more meaningful, relevant, and inspiring. Dr. Coiro is the author of the new book, From Curiosity to Deep Learning, Personal Digital Inquiry in Grades K through 5. Julie is also an associate professor at the University of Rhode Island, where she teaches literacy courses and designs research on digital literacies. She's also the co-founder of the URI Summer Institute in Digital Literacy, which is entering, I don't know if you can believe this, Julie, its 8th event this summer, with some new news on the way, and the certificate in digital literacy at the University of Rhode Island. Julie, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So Julie, in our district, we've been exploring the idea of inspired learning or learning opportunities that have made a lasting impact on people. And we've asked everybody from Yang Zhao to Tony Wagner to Chris Lehman all the same question. So what would you say would be your most inspiring or memorable learning experience during your time as a K-12 student or even during your teaching career?
So I'm going to say something that's maybe in hindsight, it probably doesn't seem very inspiring, but it has stuck with me in a way that is very much connected to what I do. And that is in high school, I had a high school English teacher who used to have in the back of his room a really huge, bigger than him, taller than him, wooden spoon. And whenever students would ask a question that was very literal, surface level, he said, "Wait, let me get my wooden spoon and spoon feed you the information." And he said, "But wait, I'm not going to spoon feed you. You are going to figure it out yourself." And so that, my mentor, Robert Miles, from high school, has stuck with me in a way that sometimes I would say some of my undergraduate students now aren't all that happy, as I'm not all that willing to spoon feed and provide information. And anybody who knows me, I'm not typically a spoon feeder. And so I think that has led me to a lot of what we do in the Summer Institute is to kind of create challenges and problems and give you just enough support. And I guess I'd spoon feed you a little bit if you needed it.
Well, what's often interesting, Julie, is that this is kind of the first time where somebody's talked about something a little bit more positive towards schools. A lot of times, a lot of our guests have had struggles as learners, and I think sometimes that story tells, I'm not going to spoon feed you, but there's like an air of support in that statement as well, right? Like there's an acknowledgement there, which I think is a nice balance between developing a student's capacity as a learner, but also knowing that there's somebody there to help them get to the next question, which is it's a form of inquiry, which is the topic of our conversation today. So I just got to first say I love the title, From Curiosity to Deep Learning, Personal Digital Inquiry in Grades K through 5. There's a lot of interesting terms just within that title alone. I think the first two that I'd really like for us to unpack is the personal and the digital modifiers in front of inquiry. I noticed you didn't go with personalized digital inquiry, so can you talk a little bit about why or how this title came to be and what those two words mean for you?
Sure. So personalized, as some of you may agree or disagree, but much of the work around personalized learning talks about ways that technology can be customized, and typically using algorithms to be able to serve up to individual learners, often via headphones and a computer, a personalized playlist or set of resources that the teacher has decided are the ones that are best suited to help a particular student. And so while that there can be lots of positive outcomes from that, to me, much of what has happened in that personalized context is that I travel around and watch kids in classrooms, and when I go into a classroom, sometimes that's called personalized. I see children with headphones on in cubbies, each doing their own private thing. Nobody's talking, nobody's making eye contact, and frankly, it makes me very nervous because to me, the whole point of learning is to engage with other people and interact in very human kinds of ways. And actually, my version of personal has nothing to do with technology at all. It has to do with building personal relationships with other people, whether they be learners or teachers, for the goal that for the goal of mattering, that kids and individuals can feel like they matter and make a difference. And so by design, you will not find the word personalized in our book at all. It is very much about building human relationships in ways that spark curiosity and engagement and conversation, and then the role that technology may or may not play in promoting those conversations even further.
Yeah, and I know we've, talked about it at length over time. The analogy that's always resonated with me comes from Stephen Downes, who talks about like a custom versus a customized car. You go to your local Toyota dealership, you can choose which type of fabric or which color, but at the end of the day, you're still you get you either get the Highlander or you don't, or you get the certain type of brand. It's a range of choices. Where you with personal or is like a custom car, where you really get the different aspects you want, and you're not necessarily bounded by what's just available by the dealer. I think the other analogy that really resonates for me is high quality meals versus teaching someone how to cook. With personalized learning, there are opportunities where you can give students some really high quality materials, or in some instances, if you've missed class or need something retaught, personalized learning, that path-based learning, can be really productive. However, if you don't like what's on the menu, you're kind of stuck. And so Downs also talks about how, personal learning is about teaching people how to cook. How do you select the ingredients? How do you combine them together to get the resources that you need or the understanding that you need? How do you find, and I think you raise a really interesting point about the social aspect, because personally meaningful things are things that you want to share with others. And how do you not only share that, but also provide value to other people through your thought, through your research, through your productions, and just building that network that you can draw upon, and then also just being able to find that network, right? Like that's another piece of it. It's not that somebody's put together a playlist for you, but you could build one yourself that you need to come back to. So I just think it's crucial.
Yeah, and I think that, in any kind of inquiry experience, the whole point is optimally, people don't know the answer. And so if I were to pull from any list, even if the list had 100 different things on it, it doesn't address the issue of problems that have yet to be solved and what different people can bring to the table. And much of what I've learned from our summer institute is I know half as much as many of the participants that come to the table, and the things that come out of that are not limited by my own thinking at all. They're things I wouldn't have even imagined. And so I think that's the beauty of inquiry, where if you open the door, if you provide some support, and then give some ways of acting on and communicating, and then you just watch what happens, that to me is the really cool part.
So transitioning to a little bit to inquiry, I think that word means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And, I know for some folks it can kind of be scary in terms of, well, if I just give the kids time to just, research whatever they want, it's gonna take a lot of time, and they don't always know what they want. But that's not necessarily that's just one type of inquiry. So you explain this in the book, but can you talk a little bit about the different types of inquiry structures that teachers can use before they get kind of this open-ended inquiry?
Yeah, sure. I mean, for me, coming from a background in reading instruction, it really parallels a lot of what we know about reading instruction, where you think with very young readers, where you model reading, and then you kind of pull back and there's guided reading, and then eventually there's independent reading. And so in the same way, the approach we take in our book is modeled after a model of inquiry that's out of Alberta, Canada. And the neat thing is that it provides 4 different ways of thinking about inquiry, rather than thinking that inquiry is this single-minded kind of thing where all kids need to be doing their own thing and there's no role for the teacher. And so, the initial stage might be something called modeled inquiry, where students kind of, or I'm going to say learners, not necessarily students, because sometimes the learners are the teachers. But someone is modeling ways of questioning or ways of collaborating and ways of analyzing things, and learners are recognizing that there's value in some of that. And then you pull back a little more and you structure inquiry where it gives some spaces for students or learners to make some choices, but it also allows teachers to feel a little safe in holding on to the curriculum and the learning outcomes that they're responsible for, but it starts to give students a little more, it structures them in some guidelines, but it gives students some choice. So you've got modeled inquiry, structured inquiry, and then you back off even further and you take out some of those structures, and now you allow learners to kind of guide their way through in ways that have more choices in how they take in information, where they go to find answer to their questions, how they share what they've shared with other people. And ultimately, the goal is some version of open inquiry, where learners get to make most of the decisions, except something really important to think about is the same way that we wouldn't say, well, now you're 5 and I'm now you can read this book independently. I'm never going to go back and model and guide things. Just because learners are comfortable and getting at a place of open inquiry 1 year, the very next week we may move back to modeling. And so the differentiation comes in kind of moving, and in the book we talk about moving along this continuum and thinking about where students can play a role in some of these inquiry-based decisions and where teachers can equally play a role.
If you're watching us live, you're getting probably a little bit of vacuum. Our custodial staff here in Mendon Upton are doing a fantastic job cleaning up the media center. I think one critical piece of this here is that there's not necessarily a value judgment on any of these types of inquiry. It's what's needed at the given time. I think the only time it becomes problematic is if you get stuck on one type of inquiry and students never have the opportunity to get to more of that guided or open inquiry. But sometimes students are going to need to model that search, that thought process of how to go about and finding those resources. So I think anytime you get into that one size fits all, or that value judgment can be challenging. And what's really great again about the book is that I think the teacher's name was Jeremy, although I could be mistaken, is that a teacher built his curriculum to have modeled inquiry at the beginning and then open up till open inquiry at the end. So having students have the opportunity to go through the inquiry process numerous times throughout the year builds those skills, but also provides them with the capabilities to take more agency over their learning process.
Yeah, I think, if you were to think of one word that's kind of equal to inquiry, it's being curiosity. And so some of that modeling in the beginning in particular, it's a lot more than let's slap up a wonder board and give kids the opportunity to ask questions. It's a lot more about modeling your own passion and modeling your own curiosity about things that are happening in the world, or things that are happening, when you walked into school this morning. And over time, kids pick up on that passion, and although they're not really sure what to do with their passion and where to go and how to focus it. And so that's where, some of those other pieces come in. And again, it's kind of we talk about it in the book as kind of this little slider scale, that there's multiple places that students can have an opportunity to have more agency. And then there's multiple places that teachers can have agency. And so trying to differentiate and figure out a balance is really, there is no one right answer. It depends on teachers' own comfort level. It depends on the kinds of kids and the comfort level of the kids. Depends on the resources you have, and how much knowledge they have about a particular topic. And so all of those things kind of come into play to figure out, where do I start with this and what might happen once we get into it.
Yeah, I think, you mentioned the Wonder Board, and the Wonder Board is if you don't have the Wonder Board or anything like that right now in your classroom, it's a great place to start. Just don't stay there, right? Like it's part of like an evolution of your practice as an educator. So I think it's all about progress. It doesn't necessarily matter where you are currently, so long as you're moving in some sort of directions, even if it's zigzag, like you're moving some ways forward. So kind of moving from like a meta structure of inquiry to a more kind of nuanced view. I'd like for you to talk a little bit about, what does the PDI model look like in practice, particularly the 4 stages. And I'm going to put that up over your shoulder as you talk about that.
Sure. So you use the word stages, and I might not use that particular word. We tend to think of them about elements.
Yep.
Because we don't necessarily suggest that they have to happen in any particular order, or that even when you plan for them to happen in a order, that's the order that it takes up. So we've got 8 elements, and actually we put them into 4 kind of reciprocal pairs. And so the first, and the way that we like to frame it is, when in your classroom do you provide students with opportunities to do these things? So, for example, when do you provide learners and yourself as a teacher an opportunity to wonder and then discover? And those two are paired together, because questioning and wondering is one thing, but actually providing the time and the space and the importance of actually discovering some answers to those questions. And you notice that we're not just saying ask questions, because ask questions suggests that you'll also find the answer. So this sometimes is just open wondering and opportunities to discover. The second set is, where in your classroom do you give kids opportunities to collaborate and discuss? And again, those 2 words are reciprocal in nature. So collaborate is more than cooperate. It doesn't mean necessarily divvying up tasks. Collaboration really means kind of building consensus, negotiating different roles and ideas, and the discussion is that personal piece that plays into the role of face-to-face or virtual, like we are, but still human-to-human kind of conversations and talk. And so we've got wonder and discover, collaborate and discuss. Another pair of elements, or another element, is create and take action. Where in your classroom, and this is often the place where we see the least amount of evidence, because this is the hardest. Where in your classroom do you give kids opportunities to create something in ways that get them to take action? And take action doesn't mean they have to change the world, although sometimes they have the power to do that. Take action might be anything from increasing learner awareness to sharing ideas with somebody who might have thought of it a different way, to something that's a little more community-based civic action. And then really the last set of elements is woven throughout the inquiry process, and that's where in your classroom do you give kids opportunity to analyze and reflect. And the analysis piece often, surprisingly, is where inquiry starts. Whether we're analyzing a finished product, or we're analyzing a picture, or a current event, and that analysis and reflection leads to questions, which is where the inquiry process then leads. And so, again, kind of, I think, Dave, you have up that image. I can't see it, but those 4 sets of wonder and discover, collaborate and discuss, create and take action, and analyze and reflect. And like I said, they're never linear. And we've found that often they interact in different ways when we create the space and set up the environment to provide for those opportunities.
And Julie, what I really appreciate too is that you've structured inquiry as like a non-linear process. I think the circle gives kind of like a visual heuristic for somebody who's thinking about like planning, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you've got to keep it rigid. So there's that fluidity between the different stages, because, you know, as you said, like sometimes the analyze and reflect leads to new wondering. Sometimes I'm going to want to discuss that with somebody, like, wait, did you hear this? And then that leads to new questions, or maybe I want to like create something that reflects. It also reminds me of a blog that I wrote in reference to my teaching practice for your teaching with technology or digital reading, but just that there's like a Bermuda triangle of inquiry where we go from wondering, discovery, okay, we're collaborating, discussing, to talking about our project, and then creating, and then, you know, if we have time, we reflect on it, but, you know, the curriculum pacing is going such that we just need to get onto it, or, you know, the kid looks at the grade on the project, okay, great. And I think that latter piece is the critical component to, I think, for 2 reasons, is that number one, it avoids that dreaded dumpster project, right? The ones the kids work on for extended periods of time, and then they end up in the trash can like right after the grading comes through. But also, I don't know, and I'll speak of this in my own teaching practice, I didn't give enough opportunities for iterative work. And what is, I mean, just, you know, think of a book. What a book is iterative work. Like, you can't, you know, there are multiple drafts and multiple phases to it, and it always gets better. And I think it's one real world skill that we don't always provide enough opportunities for students to do, or if we do, we stigmatize it. You're doing iterative work because it's not good, versus everybody does iterative work because we can always make things better. So thinking about that, analyzing and reflecting is super critical opportunity that we don't necessarily provide enough, and I'm glad that was included. One of the other things that I appreciate about the book is, you know, somebody who's a fan of inquiry, wants to dive in deep. There's that urge to kind of just rush and jump right in. But in chapter 4, there's a step before you dive into that inquiry model, and asking yourself why you're doing inquiry in the first place, and there's a self-evaluation. Can you talk a little bit about why the why is so critical with this work, or making this work sustainable?
Sure. I think the why is probably the most important, because it varies by teacher. And it's the personal part of inquiry that we believe each teacher, as they read through the book and think about what the role that inquiry plays in their classroom, it is driven by their own personal curiosities and motivations. And so in the book, you know, Karen Palookas and Beth Dobler, who are the co-authors, take some time to provide some very different reasons. So Beth was she is a literacy professor, but she almost ready to retire and took a year off to get her library master's degree. And then she went, and her reason for doing inquiry is because she was in a brand new school for the first time as a library media specialist, and wanted to see how she could contextualize some of the reading skills that kids were using in a way that was much more based in something that the students were interested in. Karen Palookas, who's a first grade teacher, was way on the other end of the spectrum, and thinking about, well, how can I deepen the learning that my students have in ways? And so we have a number of different teachers who provide lots of different motivations. In addition to their purposes, And I'm not sure, Dave, if this is what you meant by that chapter. We have a framework where when we have gone out to work with teachers, we've noticed that there's this culture in their classroom. And sometimes we go into classrooms that have exactly the same resources, technologies, but very, very different ways of doing things and different values. And that really is where we spend a lot of time talking about. We have this reflective assessment of how you build a culture in your classroom. And that is built off of Ron Richards' work with identifying 8 different forces, if you will, that are taking place in schools or any organization. And so 4 of them are very baseline kinds of things, like what are the expectations you have in your classroom? What's the language you use around inquiry? How much time and value do you put into this? And how do you model these things? And so those are kind of the underlying framework. And then there are several other items that get you to think about what are the opportunities that you offer, what routines do you work with kids for, how are they interacting, and how you set up your environment. And so 4 of those forces are kind of like what we talk about it, and Ron Richard talks about it as the story of learning. What's the story of learning you want to tell? And how do you use inquiry to communicate those values to your kids? And then the other piece is how do you start to set up the environment and the routines and the expectations in ways that lend themselves to opportunities, again, to wonder and discover, collaborate and discuss, create and take action, and analyze and reflect.
And just kind of piggyback off of those 8 aspects, you also kind of get in, this is kind of one of my secondary questions, and I'll come back to the why in a second, but I think this is related. But you not only talk about the routines and expectations, but some of just kind of like the basic skills that students could need for just, communication skills, like collaboration skills. So if your kids are having difficulty collaborating right off the bat, you might want to have some of those activities so that they're not engaging in cooperative learning, or collaborative learning versus cooperative learning. Cooperative meaning like we're just going to divide and conquer this, and you'll never, you don't have to do anything artistic because that's my share of it. But also that and that also kind of ties into that resolving disagreements. But can you talk just a little bit about some of the foundational skills, practices that teachers could have that I think that in my own teaching experience sometimes I would overlook when launching into inquiry or even just group projects that might be good to kind of scaffold over the first couple months or just prior to the inquiry?
Sure. So in the context of wondering and discovering, for example, you as teachers have probably seen the kinds of questions that kids ask are varied. And so how do we begin to model what's a juicy enough question that's open-ended enough versus something that's very close-ended? And so, we talk about in the book ways of helping kids start to generate questions and getting them to think in different ways besides just asking a question that has a certain answer. When you move to collaborate and discuss, we've found often, especially with younger children, and when they're sharing a computer, everything turns into who has their hand on the mouse, or the mouse pad, and who's operating things. And sometimes we have to back up and take away the computer and just talk about face-to-face human interaction skills and how do you take turns, and what's the value in listening and building on conversations. When we think about analyze and reflect, we've noticed, honestly, I still am challenged with this with my undergrad students in college, is what does it actually mean to reflect? And how is that different than just thinking back and recalling things. Um, and so in terms of analyzing, sometimes it means looking at, again, moving away from the computer, but going outside, or taking an object and actually looking at it from different ways. And how do you zoom in on something? And then how do you zoom back out? And so each of those, I don't really want to call them skills, but sets of competencies that are kind of like foundational understandings that are really, really important. I've seen in a lot of the research that I do outside of this book, just because you put two kids next to each other near a computer does not mean that they're going to be productive. So how do we foster the kinds of productive ways of reflecting and analyzing and wondering before we jump into, well, let's put it all together now?
Yeah, and again, in the book, there's an entire chapter dedicated to each of the 4 practices and potential pinch points, but not just like identifying the pinch points, but also productive strategies that teachers can take in order to navigate around them. But cycling back to the why, I think one thing that's critical, and I don't know your thoughts on this, is that this work can often be messy, at least for a few your first time through. And I think it's one of those things where if it's messy, the students don't get a chance to try it again, and then that iterative practice doesn't come up. Or there becomes that belief that this age group of kids can't handle it, and so therefore they never get to do it. And then later on in their school career, you have this situation where a teacher kind of further on down the line just wonders, somewhat rightfully, why don't they have these skills? So can you talk a little bit about why the why is so critical to kind of overcoming the natural obstacles that come with inquiry process or inquiry projects, at least sometimes out of the gate?
So I'm not sure if this will answer your question, so help me out because there's lots of whys, but I know one of the things that we try to stress again and again in the book, as each teacher and each classroom is very different. And so again, the whys are the personal motivations. Just like kids bring different personal curiosities, we believe teachers bring personal motivations for why they would even bother using inquiry. I think the why that started us on this was really noticing that kids wanted to matter. And in the beginning, it really wasn't about technology at all. It was about feeling like they fit in, feeling like they had a sense of belonging, like they had a role in the classroom. And one of the units, if you will, in our book is a kindergarten teacher. Her name is Ari. And she actually didn't use technology at all in her unit, if you will. And in the beginning, she really wasn't sure if this messiness was worth it. She teaches kindergarten, and she had a curriculum to follow. But along the way, she created spaces for kids to do some of the things in our model. And the passion, the excitement that the kids brought, the learning outcomes that they grew with in terms of comprehending, reflecting on things, was much greater than before. And so the rewards and the outcomes, she was finding that just the space to kind of play around and explore some of these things were bringing much greater learning outcomes to kids. The same happened with Karen. When Karen and I met, I don't know, 12 years ago or so, Karen was not fond of using technology at all. And she worked with a few teachers who were doing some professional development. She tried a few things and saw the power that the space for kids to craft their own questions and answer them created. And she ended up making more and more time in her classroom for those kinds of things to happen. So I don't know if that gets at the why that you're thinking of, and maybe you have some different thoughts about why.
No, I think you you did, I'm thinking about just you referenced Dan Pink's drive in the book and just the importance of intrinsic motivation. Um, and I think there's all sorts of, you have productive struggle and unproductive struggle. And
Mm-hmm.
what this book does, I think, helps to support productive struggle.
Mm-hmm.
But at the core of it, it's your why to keep going. And unless there's that intrinsic motivation, unless you know why you're
Right.
engaging in this work, like, and very precisely, not just I think that inquiry's cool, but that there's like it's got transformative power. Um, you're going to need to draw upon that intrinsic motivation for when learning gets messy or when learning doesn't necessarily look like um, your other colleagues' classrooms, or the times when it may look like students get a whole lot done, or maybe this inquiry project didn't go out the way in which you envisioned it. But at your core, you know that learning is a social process, in that your own questions are driven a lot of what you've done. So now that you have a resource available to help you kind of support you when you hit the bullet center, hit those pinch points, that it's that why combined with the how that leads to that productive struggle.
Yeah.
And because again, it's not easy work. It's rewarding work.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that this book that you've written helps reduce the learning curve, so
Mm-hmm.
that way you hit less of that frustrating type of struggle, but more of like almost the struggle from when you're working out, right? Like if you're sore, it's like a good tired sore. Um, so kind of shifting gears a little bit, let's do a kind of a deeper dive. I wanted to, so all right, so we've got this structure of the four kind of interlocking aspects of the PDI model. Um, let's think a little bit, or talk a little bit about planning. I want to kind of bring up this guide. I'm going to go full screen. It's the question guide, Julie, that you have
Mm-hmm.
that around the circle. So I'm going to pull you up full screen here, and then we're going to just show an image of the. So it's the questioning tool. I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about the tool and how teachers can use that resource to plan.
Sure. So this came about because as we played around with this circle model, in some ways, teachers and Karen and Beth in particular, who tried all these things out in their classroom, found it very liberating that this circle was there and they didn't yet have to worry about the day in and day out. How am I going to make Monday versus Tuesday versus Wednesday kind of work? So at the same way it was liberating, it was also a little scary because these words were so big. And so the questioning tool provided one kind of guidance, if you will, to support each of these ideas with some prompting questions. And so you'll notice as I talk about some of these questions that there is no mention of technology in the beginning. And so in each of these questions, so for example, for Wonder and Discover, how will learners engage with content and hands-on experiences to activate their wondering and discover more about their inquiry topic? So each of these questions is a place for a classroom teacher and or a librarian or a group of folks to sit down and think big picture at the end of a week or at the end of a month or at the end of a semester. How do I want learners to be engaging with things, whether they're content, whether it's each other? How will learners, if you take a look at create and take action, how will learners express their interests and new understandings through creative work? And there's that end of that question actually gives 4 different ways of taking action. Maybe it's starting conversations. Maybe it's raising awareness. Maybe it's actually doing something and acting out in the community. And maybe it's or maybe it's changing minds. So for each of these questions, it's an opportunity to think big picture at the end of that time frame. How might I think about setting up opportunities for these things? And then along the bottom, now that you've kind of got your framework of the story of learning, then it's time to start to consider how We call them digital texts and digital tools. So digital texts might be online resources, websites like Wonderopolis, or things that have a whole bunch of information. There's also digital tools. Sometimes there's things like screencasting programs that record reflections. So we're not talking about skill and drill kinds of things. Once you create the ideas about these opportunities, then it's time to consider how digital text, digital tools, and other technologies may be used to support and facilitate each of those. And that's the point where we start to get involved in what role technology can play, or actively you may choose to not have it play a role because you have other goals in mind. So I'll stop talking and see what you think of that.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's prompted a question of what kind of digital tools have you been seeing that have been particularly useful for supporting this kind of work? So I think, we've talked about it at the Institute before. Um, Tools that seem to have quite a bit of staying power, but also have transformational value that allows students to do things that they wouldn't otherwise. Is there anything that's jumped out from either your work or the Institute that you think really support the personal digital inquiry process?
So I'll answer that in two parts. The first part is when we think about the role that digital texts and tools can play, we kind of have this, I'm going to call it a knowledge continuum. It's what we call it in our book. But it's for those of you who are familiar with Bloom's taxonomy or Webb's depth of learning. There's really, technology can play a lot of different roles. And the point is to not apologize for whatever role it plays, but to kind of diversify and look across. And so at the lower end of the continuum, and by low we mean more teacher focused or teacher directed, those are things like using technologies to help learners acquire and build knowledge. And so in that case, it might be access to, again, digital texts that give kids information paired with a text-to-speech tool so that young children can ask questions and have access to information. Maybe it's not at their readability level, but it's certainly a way to build their knowledge so they can continue to ask questions. At the further end of the continuum, those are where technology can be used to help kids express their knowledge and reflect on their knowledge and actually act on it. And those are different kinds of tools that we intentionally select based on the need. One that we've found works across the continuum is a tool that we call screencasting. And that really enables kids. It's basically a online recording system where they could simply make a video and talk into it, but they could actually take a movie, if you will, a recording of what's on the screen or what they're doing and then talk through it. And so that's a way for kids to share and talk through what they've learned. It's an awesome way for kids to openly reflect on what they might have changed about things. And it's also a way for them to create screencasts of, things that they might put out, let's say for public service announcements or something where you act on your knowledge. And so really what we hope for teachers to do is to think about, first create the opportunities for one or more sets of these practices, then think about the role that technology can or can't or could or should not play. And we encourage teachers to think across the continuum, because most times, even the most well-intentioned teachers who want these magical things about inquiry to happen, often they're using the technologies themselves to give kids access to knowledge, and there's less opportunities for kids to take the reins and use technology. And that's where most of the research suggests the power of technology is.
So Julie, I put it's an older image, but it along the bottom, if you're looking on the screen, it says the experiences to deepen in learning and increase engagement and development. You can see it starts from acquiring knowledge, building knowledge, express knowledge, reflect on knowledge, and then act on knowledge for those watching at home. We're coming up on the end of our time together, so I just wanted to wrap up with two questions. The first one is, we've talked about this in theory. I'm curious if you can just talk a little bit about a personal digital inquiry project that you've seen in practice that you think has been inspiring, or one that really comes to mind when you think of the hallmark. I've got one. I can start, and then if that to give you some time to think. So I'm going to talk about. I have a colleague in Attleboro, his name's Brian Hodges, who started a 2030 project. But prior to that, actually no, I think before it became a class, one of the things that he would do is he would have students wonder and discover about the UN's global goals, and figure out which one of the global goals really resonated with the students on a personal basis. And what he would have them do is then, brainstorm based on just kind of the discovery of what they found on the Global Goals website, come up with a whole litany of different topics that were interest. And that would enable them to kind of find and coalesce around groups so they could collaborate and discuss, and those would become their research groups, so they could figure out to better understand the process and the project, to understand if they still wanted to stay together or if they wanted to go off and do their own kind of passion project. And then based on their collaboration and their discussion about the different global goals, they would come up with some sort of something they wanted to take action on a local basis. So I think of the student who wanted to push the ban the bag initiative, was concerned about plastics floating in the ocean, and his form of action was to build an awareness campaign and reach out to his local legislators about different initiatives within the state that they could use to ban the bag. He had all sorts of different kind of canvas type grocery bags. So that's the action piece. And then all the students had a reflection or blogs that they did along the course of the way. So what was nice, and kind of going back to your earlier point about it not necessarily being a linear process, the reflection was ongoing in terms of the project, and then you had that reflection at the end, and that to me is kind of the hallmark of doing, as we talk about in the Aspire Learning Project, real work that matters. The Ban the Bag is now an initiative in many municipalities, including Attleboro, but it all started from kind of a personal digital inquiry model. They didn't have necessarily a high tech school. The school wasn't one-to-one. The wireless infrastructure at the time was lacking. All they had was Chromebooks, but they still found a way to go through the entire process using the resources that they had. So to me, that's what it looks like in practice at a secondary level. I think sometimes it's a little bit more challenging to think about it at an elementary level, but with that, I'll turn it over to you, Julie, for one that sticks out for you.
Sure, I'll share one of the units. The examples in the book is by Karen Palookas, who again is one of the co-authors, and she teaches first grade in New York. And for years, she taught about plants and the plant life cycle, and wanted to have it be a little more engaging and integrate a lot more opportunities to do the things that we talked about in the PDI model. And so, she started even with having the kids plant plants, and then it ended up in the first year it ended up like a garden window, a garden on their windowsill, and eventually they decided to make a little garden in the back of their school. But once these plants start to grow, so Karen happened to throw in, they were planting radishes, I think, and she happened to throw in different kinds of radish seeds. And, as the kids were bringing their science journals out and talking and taking pictures and writing about what they were seeing, they started to notice that the radish seeds were growing in different ways. And so they're like, what's going on here? And so they're different colors, and I thought we planted all the same seeds. And so then they wanted to know, are there more than one kind of radish plant? And so now Karen was ready for that, and she had gathered a set of digital texts and resources for them to read. She also gathered books and pictures, and she brought in a gardener to talk about. And so all these different opportunities for kids to think and generate questions and put things into their journal. Along the way, they started to realize that bees were coming to their garden. And they started to wonder, well, why are the bees even there? And so it evolved into, well, questions about pollination. And so then they invited in a beekeeper. And all of a sudden, the kids became advocates for, wait a minute, bees are valuable to our community, and so we need everybody to have a garden. And that started their create and take action kinds of things. And so some of the products of their learning along the way were anything from print-based kind of science journals with drawings. They worked with a partner to create a poster around a particular kind of plant. They then did some analysis and reflection, and they gave feedback on each other's posters and how they might be more clear. They then went and shared their information with the fifth graders and their parents, and then they, a couple of weeks later, alongside these beekeeper kinds of events, ended up advocating and created a how-to guide for families to create gardens at home, and different kids would teach different parts of the audience anything about, from pollination to the different kind of seeds to the different life cycles of plants. So you can see how it was much more about the depth of learning. And yes, it enabled Karen to tap into her learning outcomes, like students will understand the parts of the plant, but also deepen their learning where some of their participatory kinds of outcomes were things like learning to collaborate with a partner, creating a project to teach others, and how do they share information in ways that advocates for things that are important in their community. So that kind of gives you a big picture of several months of activities that she planned.
All from this process, and all emanating from the students' natural interests. So Julie, just to kind of wrap up here, once people read this book, I'm confident they're going to want to dive in more deeply. For those who are more interested in, personal digital inquiry or digital literacies, what opportunities are there available for them to expand their capacity? Are there events, programs, workshops that they might be able to access?
Sure. So first off, people should know that as part of the book itself, there's a study guide that's available free online that can kind of walk you through the different chapters, and we highly encourage you to find somebody in your school or maybe in your district to kind of work through ideas. If you don't have somebody in your school, or even if you do, you are more than welcome to join us at our Summer Institute in Digital Literacy, which is highly informed, the same elements of personal digital inquiry, but for adults, where you get the opportunity to wonder and discover and collaborate and discuss and create and take action. And so for 8 years, as Dave mentioned at the beginning, that has been held for one very intensive week, usually the second or third week of July in Providence, Rhode Island. And for the next 3 years, we're actually taking that to Chicago, where the University of Rhode Island will partner with our colleagues from the National Louis University. And so that's one opportunity for you to kind of take a deep dive in. You can come by yourself, you can come with a partner, you work with a partner during the week, and you have access to about 80 to 120 classroom teachers, library media specialists, community media makers, and folks in higher ed. If you really enjoy it, we have what we call Tier 2 Summer Institute, where you come back and you learn a little bit more about leadership. Now that you've kind of gotten the ideas going in your classroom, how do you take a role in moving it perhaps across your grade level, or maybe you don't have your own classroom, maybe you're a district leader of one way or another that can play in that way. And then if you really like that, we also have 2 online courses that you can take for graduate credit. I teach one, I think it's called the Digital seminar in digital literacy. It's all about a deep dive into not just inquiry, but online reading comprehension and how do you access and make sense of information. And then Renee Hobbs provides the other online course in digital authorship and how you use all these tools to, as teachers, share your ideas and identity with other folks out there. And all those 4 courses together equal the graduate certificate in digital literacy that is also offered from the University of Rhode Island. I think that might be it.
And if you really love it, you can go to Tier 3, which is, which is the ultimate open inquiry process of all.
There you go. And I do, yeah, so we just started last year, and it worked out very, very well. We had about 25 people who came back for what we call now Tier 3, is you come and you just pick up on the energy of the group, and you create your own inquiry project based on experiences that you've had. And I do want to mention one other thing is it's called the PD Into Practice blog that 3 folks from our Summer Institute in past years, Kara Clayton, Amanda Murphy, and Stephanie Branson, have, I think for 2 years now, monthly, they collect stories from teachers who have come to the Summer Institute to find out what's happening now that they're back in their schools. And you can read all that in the PD Into Practice blog to start to see the impact that it has both on individual educators in their classrooms and in schools and quite often in districts. So that's really exciting for us as well.
Awesome. Well, Julie, thanks so much for your time this afternoon. It's always great to talk to you about a lot of different things, but especially when we get to dive into inquiry. Again, the book is From Curiosity to Deep Learning, Personal Digital Inquiry for Students in Grades K through 5. But if you're a secondary teacher like I was, don't let the title throw you off, because it's chock full of resources for those who teach at the secondary level as well. The Inspired Learning Conversation returns next week with John Warner, the author of Why They Can't Write. We will discuss strategies educators can use to detox our students from the 5-paragraph essay and much, much more. Again, we'll be live at 4 o'clock on the 5th, so be sure not to miss it. For the Mendon Upton Regional School District, I'm Dave Quinn, and this is the Inspired Learning Project. Take care.